come up with some answers, some of the things that we were discussing. And one of them was Shalashudis. Victor had mentioned that Shalashudis, there's a earliest time when you're allowed to eat Shalashudis. Would you be allowed to have it in the morning? And he mentioned that maybe not. And the truth is, he's correct. In Shulchan Aruch, it does say that the time for Shalashudis is from the beginning of the Zman of Mincha Gedola. Mincha Gedola means the large Mincha, which means after 6.5 hours of the day, which means like 12:30 on a regular day, would be Mincha Gedola. That would be which is actually the earliest time a person can daven Mincha. That would be when you could start eating Shalashudis. Now, there is an opinion that says you could do it early. There are opinions that say you could do it earlier, but Shulchan Aruch follows this view that the Zman is from the Zman of Mincha Gedola. So that I just want to emphasize that that is correct, as Victor had mentioned. That there, even though there are views, there's a Ran and I think a Bal Halachat Bahag that says you could have the meal even in the morning, Shalashudis, but the Shulchan Aruch paskins that it's from the time of Mincha Gedola, and that's so that's good to know that there is a Zman, there is a time when the earliest time for Shalashudis that's accepted in Halacha, and so that's one point that should be mentioned. The next point is we had a little discussion about eating on Erev Pesach. Would there be a way of eating when Shabbos falls on Erev Pesach? We talked a little about how do you eat Shalashudis on that day, because you can't eat matzah. Of course, it's the Zman. You're not allowed to have matzah on Erev Pesach. It's considered a terrible thing to do. It's considered you can't control yourself. Wait till the night, and the Yerushalmi compares it to someone who has relations with his fiancée before the wedding. They can't control himself. That's what it happened. That's what it's like when a person eats matzah on Erev Pesach and doesn't wait for the Seder. So the question is, how do you eat Shalashudis on Erev Pesach? And this question is especially applicable based on the halacha that I just mentioned in that we paskin in Hilchas Shabbos, that Shalashudis has to be eaten after the Zman after Mincha Gedola, which means 6.5 hours into the day, which means it's already prohibited to have chametz. So you can't have chametz, and you can't have matzah. You're prohibited to have chametz. There's a prohibition, a biblical prohibition of having chametz on Erev Pesach, and there's a rabbinic prohibition of having matzah on Erev Pesach. So how would you have Shalashudis? And there you have different options. One of them is in Shulchan Aruch. There's a whole chapter in Shulchan Aruch about this, in chapter 444. 444, yeah. And it mentions that you can only eat matzah ashira. Matzah ashira means matzah that was made with eggs or with oil and other, with other types of liquids, not water. And because you can't be yotzeh the mitzvah of matzah on Pesach with it, and therefore you'd be allowed to have it on Erev Pesach. And so that would be one option. But then he says, but we have a minhag not to have it on Erev Pesach because of a problem. We're nervous. We're nervous that that it might rise. And therefore, we are makbid not to have egg matzah. Matzah shir is really egg matzah. So we are makbid not to have egg matzah on Erev Pesach or on Pesach as well, and therefore you can't eat shalashudas with egg matzah because we have a minhag not to have it from Erev Pesach from the 5th hour to throughout Pesach. So because of that chumrah of ours, that the minhag is not to have egg matzah unless someone is sick. We only allow elderly people who have health issues to have egg matzah. Otherwise, it's prohibited. At least in the Ashkenazic communities for sure. I don't know about the Sephardic as well. Do they also have that thing not to eat
So
egg matzah?
we're allowed to eat it, but it's only mizonot always. It's never hamotzi. So that's
Well,
a
but
separate
yeah,
story
that's another story. Even regular matzah is mizonah
during the year,
during the year. Regular matzah,
but not
right?
not on Pesach.
Not on Pesach, right? But okay, so what do you do for shalashudas on Erev Pesach that falls on Shabbos? So um so the first option was egg matzah, but then we said we minhag not to have egg matzah. So then the next option is you could have basar v'dagim and other types of lifton, other types of food that are eaten with bread. So either meat, fish, or other foods that are eaten with bread, because some say that you can be yoitze, you fulfill shalashudas on Shabbos. Some say you could fulfill it with these type of items. So that would be option B. And if you don't have that, then you have the option of fruits, because some say you could be yoitze shalashudas with a fruit. Now, keep in mind that the source of these opinions, interestingly enough, is our Gemara that we learned together, that it's mine targima you could fulfill a meal, could be considered a meal. And what is mine targima? So we had Tosfos's opinion that it was basar, dagim, meat, and fish, and other things that are eaten with bread. And Rashi's opinion was that targima was delicacies like fruits. So you could fulfill it with fruits. You could fill it with meat and fish and other foods that are eaten with bread. And then the Alter Rebbe and Shulchan Aruch, he brings that now it would make sense, and this was my what I mentioned when we were learning it, that maybe there's a way to have gebraks. You could have matzah that's you could have matzah that's not kosher for the Seder, but it would be, you could fulfill a meal with it. So he brings down that it would make sense to use matzah mevusheles, that matzah that is cooked, in other words, cooked with liquid, but it's already matzah, and it's not nimucha legamri b'bishul, it hasn't totally dissolved in the liquid when it was cooked, but rather it has pieces, it's piecey, that each piece has a kizayas in it of the matzah, maybe something like what do you call that?
Matzah bra, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe that would be, maybe you could have shalashudas matzah brai, and if each piece has a kazayas, now this is the typical matzah brai, they generally break up into smaller pieces, but let's say you would have pieces of matzah that are a kazayas, so you'd have like bigger size matzah brai, and you could make hamoitzi on it, and you could say a brechas hamazon on it, you could bench, and you could fulfill shalashudas according to everyone. So it would make sense to use that for shalashudas, because you can't fulfill the matzah, the seder, with matzah mevusheles, with cooked matzah. However, the minhag is not to do this. So that is the reason why we don't do it. However, if someone does, or a person who does that, and someone who has a custom to eat egg matzah, they have to be careful that they should eat the meal before the Sha'ah Asiris. Here again, mentions that 10th hour, which is before the 10th hour, which would basically be the last 3 hours of the day. So from 3 to 4, 4 to 5, 5 to 6, right? Approximately, if the day starts at 6 and the day ends at 6, so it would be like from 3 o'clock, from the 10th hour, you would have to make sure not to eat anything because you have to have the matzah at night of the Seder L'Teyavim. So that is something that we had mentioned in class. So this is where it's brought in Shulchan Aruch about the Shalosh Shudas, eating it on Erev Pesach that falls on Shabbos. Now in the laws
Rabbi,
of
the minhag, you said the minhag not to do it, but by the Sfaradim, that is exactly the minhag to what to do on
what
to make this like egg
matzah brai. Oh,
well, yeah, make it into like a matzah brai and say hamotzi on it
uh-huh.
and make shalashudas with it.
And that's what you have for Shalosh Shudas. Uh-huh.
That's what to do. Yeah, that's the recommended for the Sfaradim, for not maybe not all Sfaradim, but that's what the rabbi here told us to do.
Oh, wow. Okay. So that's good. That's what we had come up with, that there's such an option. Okay, great. Now, I will just mention, so when we talk about Shalosh Shudas, so as I mentioned earlier, for those that came late, also there is a earliest time according to Shulchan Aruch when a person can start having Shalosh Shudas. It's the time is Zman for Mincha Gedola, which means 12:30 approximately. 6.5 hours into the day is the earliest Shalosh Shudas that a person can have, even though there are other opinions. But the Shulchan Aruch follows this, that the earliest time is 12:30. Now, what can you have to be Yotze Shalosh Shudas? So in Shulchan Aruch, it brings down that Yesh Makilin, some are lenient that you could fulfill the Shalosh Shudas with kemach that's made that with any meichel, with any foods that are made from the 5 grains that you make mezainis on. So that's one option. Anything that's mezainis, and some are lenient even more that you could fulfill it even with things that even with things that you mix that you malafes, the pas that you put on bread, like fish and meat and other things that you would put on bread. And some are even lenient that you could have fruits. So we see basically these 3 levels of Shalosh Shudas, where it's either mezainis, either meat, fish, or other things that you eat bread with, or even fruit. And these are based on our Gemara. Now, I also do want to mention, I shouldn't leave it out. There is the other opinions, not that they're not mentioned at all, because the Shulchan Aruch does bring down, the Alter Rebbe brings down, person only has enough for 2 meals. If he divides it into 3 meals, he won't have enough, so he should have 2 meals, and better not to have the 3rd meal. Nevertheless, if his morning meal reaches until the time of Mincha Gedolah, should divide it into 2 with Berchas Hamazon, because the 2nd meal he'll be satisfied right away. And l'chatchila, you shouldn't wait. Preferably, don't wait until you shouldn't wait to eat your meal late, because you're not allowed to fast until Chatzos on Shabbos. But if you did, just 1 second. The person who has a muzzin for meals for two meals, if he divides it into 3, he won't have every meal enough to satisfy. So better he should have 2 meals satisfying instead of having 3 meals, not satisfied. Nevertheless, if the morning meal lasts very late until the time for Shalashudis, so then he should divide it in two through Berchas Hamazon, divide it with a Berchas Hamazon, and which is something that was mentioned a little earlier in this chapter of Shulchan Aruch. And because when he eats the second meal, he will be satisfied immediately, and that would work. Nevertheless, even when you have it in the morning, you should divide it in two and stop with a Birchas Hamazon in the middle, because some say that you fulfill the obligation of the third meal then. And even though the main halacha follows that you have to wait till 12:30 to have the Shalashudis, nevertheless, you have no other way to do it. Better you should try to fulfill it this way, even though it's not the main opinion. So there is such a mention of the fact that Shalashudis, of these opinions, that Shalashudis does work even earlier. So that's, I just wanted to mention that there is such a option. It's a situation. It's not a common scenario, so we don't have to go into the exact details. But it's not like it's not mentioned at all in Shulchan Aruch. There is such a scenario where it could be applicable. But the main halacha follows the other view that Shalashudis starts at 12:30 or on an exact day of 6 o'clock is the sunrise, 6 o'clock sunset. And what we see here is that our Gemara is the source of the leniencies for Shalashudis that could be had, you could have with either the three opinions here, which are either mezainos, fruits, or meat and fish. Okay, so what I wanted to do was go over, redo the Gemara here from the beginning and just get some clarity, because it's a very complicated Gemara. So we're starting at 27a, Mishnah, and I'm going to just go through it, and hopefully we'll feel that we know it well now. Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Eliezer says that a person's obligated to eat in the sukkah 14 meals, achas b'yom v'achas b'layla, one in the morning, one in the evening. So Rabbi Eliezer is basically saying that you need to have 14 meals, and the understanding is in a sukkah. And as the Gemara will explain, that it has to do with the fact that if that's what you normally do during the year, you have 2 meals a day. So on Sukkot, you should also have 2 meals in the sukkah. And you're supposed to dwell in the sukkah like you do in your house. So that would mean that you should have 2 meals every day of Sukkot inside the sukkah, and you'd be obligated to eat these meals in the sukkah. The rabbis say that it's not set in, it's however you'd like to have it, you could have in the sukkah, chutz mi leila yom tov rishon shel chag bavad, besides for the first night. The rabbis say the first night you need to have. The other days, it's really just like in your house. You don't have to eat if you don't want. You could eat, you could skip a meal. So the same thing as on Sukkot, you could theoretically skip at least a full-fledged meal, and you could get away with without having a meal, or a Yom Tov meal, or at least a Sukkah meal. You could get away with a smaller, with some type of a snack or something else that's not considered a Sukkah meal. You could get away with. The first night is an obligation, and it could be that Rabbi Eliezer talks about the 14 meals. We mentioned it could be that he's talking about besides the first night 14 meals, or it could be talking about that he's including the first night. And then we had a question about Shalashudis. Why is he skipping out the meal of Shalashudis? And we had different explanations of why he doesn't mention the meal of Shalashudis. But the main point is that Rabbi Eliezer holds 14 meals you're obligated in the sukkah, and the rabbis hold only the first night. Rabbi Eliezer, and additionally, Rabbi Eliezer says, a person who didn't eat on the night of the first day of Yom Tov, Yashlam b'leil Yom Tov Achron Shel Chag. So he didn't eat the first night in the Sukkah. He can have a makeup on the night of Shmini Atzeres, and at least the way Rashi learned that is that he is going to have a makeup, even though he's not going to be eating in the Sukkah. He is somehow able to make up the first night that he missed out in eating in the Sukkah. He would be able to make it up in the Leila Yom Tov Ha'achron Shel Chag. That's Rabbi Eliezer's view. And the rabbis say that there is no makeup. Now, the thing is, Rabbi Eliezer holds you really obligated all the meals. So some say that that's what Rabbi Eliezer is really saying, that even the other meals you could also make up. And Rabbi Eliezer's the mention of Mishalayachal Leila Yom Tov Rishon is really talking about, according to the rabbis, that according to the rabbis are limited, that they hold even the first night is an obligation. So Rabbi Eliezer says if you missed out on the first night, there's a makeup, and the rabbis, even though they also hold that it's an obligation on the first night, but they hold that there is no tashlumin, ein la davar tashlumin, there is no makeup. V'alzen nemar muvas lo yuchal liskan. On this it says it's a crookedness that can't be fixed. And v'chesrein lo yuchal limanis chisaron, something that's some type of a loss that can't be included in, a missed situation that you can't be included in. This is referring to someone who missed out the first meal of Sukkot. You can't make it up. Now, so the Mishnah basically says two main points. One is about how many meals you have to eat in the Sukkah, and the other thing was if you can make up the meals or the meal on Sukkot, and that would be the simple understanding of the Mishnah. Now we have the Gemara, my time with Rabbi Eliezer. So what was the reason of Rabbi Eliezer that you have to have 14 meals in the Sukkah? So the reason is because Teshvu came to Duru, that because we learned that you have to dwell in the Sukkah just like you dwell in your house, just like you live, Madira Achas B'yem B'achas B'layla, just like in your house you have one by day and one by night, Ach Sukkah Achas B'yem B'achas B'layla. Also on Sukkot, you have one meal by day and one meal by night, and you would need to have that in the Sukkah because it has to be exactly like you have at your home. You have to dwell in the Sukkah like you dwell in your home. Rabbanan and the rabbis, what do they do with that lesson of Teshvu Kain Taduru? Kedira, it has to be like you dwell at home, but they look at it a little differently. That Madira Iboy Yachel, just like in your home, in your residence, if you want to eat, Iboy Lo Yachel, if you want, you don't have to eat. So Av Sukkah Nami, also Sukkah, also Iboy, if you want, Achel, you could eat. Iboy, if you want, Lo Yachel, you don't have to eat. So that is the opinion of the rabbis, and therefore the rabbis do not agree that you need to have these 14 meals in the Sukkah. Now, we understand that the rabbis also hold that you need to have Yom Tov. You need to celebrate Yom Tov. But the question and the understanding of the rabbis is not that you don't have to have these meals, but that they are not intrinsically an obligation of eating them in a Sukkah. You could fulfill the mitzvah of eating a Yom Tov meal, possibly even outside the Sukkah. Why? Well, the number one is there's ways of eating. If you only eat a kazayas, could be that you fulfill the mitzvah of Yom Tov, but you don't fulfill the obligation of Sukkah, because on Sukkah, the obligation is to have more than a kibetza, to eat it in a Sukkah. It's not called eating a meal unless it's the size of more than a kibetza. That's what we learned on the previous page of the Gemara, and therefore you could possibly fulfill the obligation of eating a meal without necessarily eating it in the Sukkah, because the Sukkah doesn't eat. You don't have to eat that in the Sukkah. So the rabbis would say that that's fine. Rabbi Eliezer would say, no, you need to have it in the Sukkah, at least the way the Gemara understands it now. Rabbi Eliezer would say you need to have it in the Sukkah, even though in order to fulfill the obligation of Sukkahs. And according to the rabbis, no, you don't need necessarily to have if you could fulfill the mitzvah of eating your meal without being in a Sukkah, you would fulfill it. The other point is that if it rains, according to Rabbi Eliezer, you need to eat your meals in a sukkah. Now, being that that if you're supposed to have 14 meals, so what happens if it rains? If it rains, seemingly on the one hand you're exempt, you're allowed to eat. You're allowed to eat outside the sukkah because it's. But on the other hand, he holds, or he might hold. Maybe there's a discussion about this, but he might hold that you would have to come back and have the meal. Let's say it stops raining. Would you be obligated in coming back into the sukkah to fulfill the extra meal because you need to have 14 meals? It's possible maybe to understand it that way. While the rabbis would say no, you're definitely not obligated in coming back into the sukkah because you don't have to have any meals in the sukkah. If you were exempt, you're exempt. So that would be another point that could be mentioned regarding this argument between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chacham. Now, the Gemara says, what about the first night? The Gemara says, the rabbis say you don't have to eat. The first night also, why do you say that you're obligated? The Mishnah said that even the rabbis agree the first night is definitely an obligation. So on that, the Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Mishum, Rabbi Shimon ben Yitzchok, so on that, it says the first night is an obligation, and it's based on a Gzeir Shava of Chamisha Aser, Chamisha Aser. Gzeir Shava means that it says the same words in one place, and it says the same words in another place. And we learn that this means that if you have to have whatever it says in one place, it applies in the other place. If you have to have matzah on Pesach night, you also have to eat in a sukkah on Sukkot night. And this would mean that the obligation of eating in a sukkah on the first night of Sukkot is connected to an obligation based on Pesach, and this could have special rules. In other words, there's discussion in the commentaries about what to what extent is that. And we mentioned Tosfos over here brings from the Yerushalmi, and we mentioned that there could be other ramifications of this with regard to number one, the obligation on Pesach is a kazayas. Does that mean the first night of Sukkot, your real obligation is only a kazayas to eat in Sukkah? Even though normally the obligation in a sukkah, to say Leisha Basukkah, fulfill the mitzvah of Sukkah, is more than a kibetza, more than an egg size. But maybe because you have a Gzeir Shava, you could fulfill maybe a kazayas is enough, because we learned from Pesach. Another point is that maybe that you need to have, you're not allowed to eat after the 10th hour. It's a prohibition, eating after the 10th hour. So it could be the same thing applies to Sukkot as well. And what would happen if it rained on the first night of Sukkot? You definitely have to come back and eat. You definitely have to eat in the sukkah. The question is, the question would be, if it rained on the first night of Sukkot, would you be allowed to eat in the sukkah in the rain and say the bracha leishev basukkah and fulfill the mitzvah? So one way of looking at this is it's a gzeira shava. It's a gzeira shava. It's a obligation based on Pesach that you're obligated to eat a kazayas in the sukkah, possibly even if it rains. You still have an obligation of eating in the sukkah. So there's a way of learning and understanding this gzeira shava, that if the first night of Pesach, the first night of Sukkot, it rains, you could even eat in the sukkah with saying the bracha leishev by sukkah, and you don't have to come back to the sukkah afterwards when it stops raining, because you fulfilled the obligation of tesvav, of the obligation similar to Pesach, that even though it rains, there's no exemption. There's another way of looking at it, that there's still an exemption if it rains. There's two ways of looking at it, but one way of looking at it is that there's no exemption of rain on the first night. There's an exemption of rain on other nights, but on the first night, the exemption of rain doesn't apply, because it's a whole different obligation on the first night. The new obligation is an obligation similar to Pesach. On Pesach, if it rains, you're still obligating matzah, right? So the obligation on Sukkot night, there's room to say that you can fulfill the mitzvah even when it rains, which is a big question and the rest of the Pesach of Sukkot. Are you allowed to say a bracha leishev basukkah when it rains? If it's raining and you're uncomfortable, are you even allowed to eat in the sukkah when it rains if you're uncomfortable? According to some opinions, you really should not be eating in the sukkah when it rains, and it's called the hedyoit, which we spoke a little about eating in the sukkah even when it rains. Even though, of course, there's a minhag among chassidim maybe to eat in the sukkah when it rains, but it's not a it's not, in Shulchan Aruch. There's more discussion about it. If you not only if you can say a bracha leishav sukkah, but maybe you shouldn't really be doing it. Maybe it's not appropriate to sit in the rain and eat in the sukkah. But the first night is a different story. The first night, there's room to say that you have a mitzvah even on the first night, because of the source of this obligation is not the same source of the obligation the rest of Sukkot. Teshvu ke'ein taduru, you dwell the way you dwell in a house, and if it rains, you don't hang out in a room in your house where it's pouring down rain or where it's dripping rain on. You're not gonna sit in your house that way. So the rest of Sukkot you're for sure exempt, but on the first night there's room to say that you could even fulfill the mitzvah, and you need to fulfill the mitzvah even if it's raining. You sit in the rain and you say the bracha leishav sukkah, and you fulfill the obligation. Now, so that's this is the argument between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim about how the first night is for sure an obligation going to everyone. The rest of Sukkot is an argument between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis. Now, the truth of the matter is, even the first night, there's a question if Rabbi Eliezer agrees with this Gzeir Shavah. Does Rabbi Eliezer also learn the Gzeir Shavah and hold that the first night has another source to it, or is the first night, according to Rabbi Eliezer, it's just like the rest of the other 14 days? So the commentaries debate about that, but that's getting a little sidetracked. So basically, the argument between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis is more about the rest of Sukkot. The first night, everyone agrees that is an obligation. There's an obligation on the first night. Okay, then comes the next Gemara, and it's Va'id Amar Rabbi Eliezer. And Rabbi Eliezer also said about the makeup. Here comes this complicated discussion about having some type of a makeup on Shmini Atzeres for a meal that you missed, either on the first night, or possible to learn the Gemara that it means on the other meals of Sukkot. If you miss, you could make it up on Shmini Atzeres. So Rabbi Eliezer. So Rabbi Eliezer also says that you could make up the meal on Shmini Atzeres. Didn't Rabbi Eliezer say that you have to eat? You have to eat 14 meals in a sukkah, whether by day, one by day, one by night. And if so, the question of the Gemara is that you need to have it in a sukkah. How could you fulfill the mitzvah on Shmini Atzeres if you're not going to eat in the sukkah? And if you are going to eat in the sukkah, you're going to be over Bal Taifa. That's at least the way Rashi learned this Gemara. That's the problem. That how could you make it up without being in a sukkah? And so the Gemara answers, Amar Bira, Amar Ba'ami, Chaza by Rabbi Eliezer. So the answer was that Rabbi Eliezer backs out. He retracts from his opinion. And what's his opinion that he retracts from? That he initially said you have to have 14 meals in the sukkah. Here he says, no, you don't have to. And you don't have to have 14 meals. You can even skip meals. He holds like the rabbis. Teshvu kein taduru. If you want to skip a meal, you can skip a meal. The first night, you're obligated. What about making up that meal? The first night meal, Rabbi Eliezer still holds his original thing that you can make it up on Shmini Atzeres. But the other meals, you're not obligated to have. And how does that answer the question, which is something that we dealt with? In other words, you don't have to have 14 meals. Okay, what about the first night? You have to have that meal. So I skipped it. I can make it up on Shmini Atzeres. Well, how does that work? I still thought I need to have it. Yeah, I thought I need to have it in a sukkah. Yeah, right. I need to have the meal of the first night in a sukkah. So how does it help if I'm going to eat it on Shmini Atzeres, where it's not going to be in a sukkah. So the answer is that the Gemara's original understanding was that you need to have these 14 meals because of Teshvu Kien Taduru, that you need to have it, you need to have 14 meals, is all about dwelling in the sukkah. And you can't fulfill them outside of a sukkah, so you can't make a makeup. Then the Gemara changes it and says, no, Rabbi Eliezer doesn't hold of that anymore. He changed his mind. He only holds that the first night is an obligation. Now, the first night, what obligation is the first night? The first night obligation is similar to Pesach. Similar to Pesach. So it's not that the first night is an obligation to eat it in the sukkah. It's just that it's an obligation to celebrate Sukkot on the first night. That's the obligation. It's the obligation to sell. Happens to be you have an obligation to eat the meal in the sukkah, but it's more of an obligation to have a meal on the first night. No, originally, how had we learned Teshvu came to Duru, that you have to dwell in your house the way you dwell in a sukkah, that it's all about dwell in the sukkah the way you dwell in a house. You have to dwell in your sukkah properly with eating these 14 meals. So then the Gemara had a big problem. You can't do a makeup on Shmini Atzeres when you're not in a sukkah. But now we're changing it. The Gemara's answer is, no, you don't have to have those 14 meals in the sukkah. The first night is based on a Gezerah Shava from Pesach. It's not about necessarily eating in the sukkah. It's about having a meal like on Pesach. You have to have matzah. Here, you have to have a meal on the night, just like similar to Pesach. And it's sukkahs. You have to have it in the sukkah. You messed up. It's okay. You still have to do the makeup. It's more about the makeup than doing it in the sukkah. So now you would be able to have it even outside the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres. Now Rashi adds another point, and that is that it has to do with karbonos, the sacrifices, and the sacrifices are learned. They teach us that you could make up for the first night. You could make up sacrifices, something that's an obligation on the first day could be made up on the other days and even on Shmini Atzeres. That's what we learn from the that you could make up that's what we learned from the sacrifices that you could make up on other days. So according to that, what comes out is that something that's an obligation on the first day can be made up on the other days. Now, originally, the Gemara's understanding was that you're obligated on all the days of you're obligated to have meals on all the days of Sukkot, and on that, the Gemara maybe had a problem. How could you make up other days? We don't find any makeup on other days of Sukkot to make up for something that you missed out on a different day. But we do find it on the first day. That's something that was an obligation on the first day. You can make up on the other days of Sukkot. So what comes out is that the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, the way Rashi is understanding it, is that there is a makeup for missing that first night meal on Shmini Atzeres, and the reason being because the obligation of eating that meal was not intrinsically connected to Sukkah, and two, it's similar to the sacrifices that you can bring a sacrifice on the Shmini Atzeres to make up for the rest of Sukkot, which even though it's considered like maybe a holiday of its own, but it's still considered kosher for a makeup. So you can do a makeup even for Sukkot. So that's the conclusion according to the way Rashi is understanding this, and there is a way to make it up, and that's the understanding of the Gemara that Rabbi Eliezer backed out of his obligation of the 14 meals, but now it's only one. It's only an obligation of of the first night, and there is a makeup for that first night. Now, the Gemara says, Mashlim b'mai. Well, how do you make it up? So the Gemara says, Ilema berifta. Maybe you can make it up by having a meal. So the Gemara says, Su'uda diyoimeka. You're eating the meal of that day, and that's normal to have a meal on that day that you're anyway eating a meal that day. So how would it be recognizable that this is a makeup for another meal? So the Gemara says, Elamai yashlim b'mine targima. Rather, what are you doing? You're going to have these targima, which Rashi learns meant delicacies. Tosfos learned it meant meat, fish, or other things you eat with bread. The Rosh learns that it means mezainas. So you could have some type of targima, some type of a addition that will be considered a meal. Now, one of the things that it's a little vague is, are you eating this as part of your meal, or is it addition to your meal, or it's after your meal? Now, Rashi does say li'achar shasilek, after you finish your meal. Silek means that you ended, after you ended your meal. It's a little vague if it's before benching or after benching. You did finish your meal. Definitely, it sounds like you would say that maybe it's after benching. You're having another meal, and you're having this meal with these type of targima, and that's going to be considered a makeup meal. Now, we had a whole discussion yesterday of the fact that having these type of targima, Tosfos says, well, fruits don't need a sukkah, and if you're going to translate targima to be fruits, so how could that be considered a makeup for the first night of Sukkot if the fruits don't even need to be eaten in a sukkah? It doesn't make sense that would be considered a makeup for a meal. And Tosfos therefore says it must mean meat or fish. And then you could say maybe that normally should need a sukkah, and theoretically you could have had that on the first night of Sukkot, and you didn't, and you'll have it now. It'll be a makeup for the first night. Now the problem we had yesterday was, but meat, fish, and other things you don't need a sukkah for. So yesterday we came up with this idea that maybe when it's during a meal, then you do need a sukkah. And that's an interesting halacha that's not 100% so clear. It's brought in the Mishnah Brura. The Mishnah Brura brings something like that of the Sharat Tzion, that maybe, when you have a meal, when you're eating a meal, so even though you get up in the middle of the meal to eat some other stuff, you can't eat that other stuff outside of a sukkah, even though it's normally exempt from a sukkah because you're part of a meal. But it's not 100% clear. The Mishnah Brura asked some questions on it. Does that mean you can't take a drink? Let's say you go into your house in the middle of a meal. You go into your house and you take a drink. You can't drink some water in the house during a meal because you're in the middle of a meal. So all of a sudden you can't, so, it just seems surprising to say that you're not going to be allowed to have anything while you're in the middle of a meal, that you wouldn't be allowed to have any snack or something when you leave. Once you leave the meal, seemingly you're not eating a kvios now. You're not eating an established meal. You're doing a little snack. Oh, you're in the middle of a meal, so it can't be. You're in the middle of a meal. Okay, but now I left the table. I'm going inside. I'm eating a peanut. I can't eat a peanut walking around inside my my house because because I have a meal. And I also found a source in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch where he talks about eating a kazayas in the sukkah and then going out of the sukkah and eating outside the sukkah. How could you have such a thing? How could you eat in the sukkah, kazayas, and then go out? It must be you're in the same meal. Even though you're in the same meal, you're even eating inside. But it's less than a measurement that you would need to eat in a sukkah. So it's allowed. So you see clearly that it's not 100% that you can't. Not everyone agrees with this. Additionally, it seems to me that the Gemara doesn't mean that you're eating this as part of your meal. You finished your meal, as Rashi said, lachar shesile. So it seems that this is a new meal, and the reason why Tosfos says that you could fulfill it with meat or fish. Meat or fish doesn't need a sukkah. That's not 100% accepted. Tosfos holds that meat and fish does need a sukkah. Some say even fruit need a sukkah. Of course, we don't paskin that way in general. Shulchan Aruch, it talks about meat and fish. It talks about fruit, that even if you make a meal out of your meat or out of your fruits, you don't need a sukkah. But there are shitas that hold that fruits need a sukkah. It's based on a Gemara and Yuma. There's the opinions in the Gemara about it, and there is such a concept. And Tosfos here seems to hold that if you make a meal out of maser v'dagim, that would mean you would need to have a sukkah. And here you're going to do a makeup by eating that on Shmini Atzeres, where you're eating that in you're going to eat that in your house on Shmini Atzeres, but you'll fulfill the obligation of eating of the meal that you missed on Sukkot. Now, so that's the way the Gemara answers it, that you're fulfilling your obligation outside the sukkah. Oh, you're fulfilling your obligation not in the sukkah, but nevertheless you could fulfill the obligation with this mine targima. And we even have a brisa that says Tanya nami hachim hishlam mine targima yotza. You fulfilled your obligation. So you see that you could have a makeup meal with targima. Now, why do the rabbis argue on this? So the rabbis don't see that. The rabbis argue on this seemingly because they don't see that there's an option for makeup. Where do you come up with this idea? Just because korbanos work doesn't necessarily mean that you could make up a meal. But they're not exactly arguing on the law of Rabbi Eliezer that targima could be a meal. In other words, they seem to be agreeing that targima could be considered a meal. They're just arguing that it doesn't work for sukkah to do a makeup. And so that's the source that when you have an extra meal, that could be considered, targima could be considered a meal. So shalosh shudas would be similar to this idea that what you're doing an extra meal, and you're eating an extra meal, that could be considered shalosh shudas. When you eat an extra meal on Shabbos, that would be like the shalosh shudas meal. It's like an extra meal on Shabbos. It could be also fulfilled with targima. So in other words, even though this is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, seemingly we could say that the rabbis agree that such a thing, in concept that could be considered a meal. It's just not a meal of it could be considered a meal. It's just here it doesn't work to do makeup. So that would be the source of being able to be yotze shalosh shudas with other types of foods. Okay, so now the truth is, Tosfos over here had learned a little different pshat in the end point, and the Gemara had asked, how could Rabbi Eliezer allow you to have your makeup on the last day of Sukkot, meaning Shmini Atzeres? How could you have it? You don't have a Sukkah. And the answer was, chazar by Rabbi Eliezer, he still holds you need 14 meals. He just holds they don't have to be necessarily in a sukkah. It's all about the 14 meals. So in other words, the way Tosfos learns, it's not that he backs out of the whole concept. He backs out of the idea that you would need to eat these in a sukkah. He says no, you can eat them. You can eat the. You have to eat the meals. You have 14 meals that you're obligated in eating, but there is a makeup, and on that the makeup would be on Shmini Atzeres. You could make them up, and you could make it up with this Mine Targima. Okay. Now the Gemara continues and says, Shoal Apotropos Shal Agrippas HaMelech as Rabbi Eliezer. So the Apotropos of Agrippas HaMelech, the person in charge, I called him the manager, the building manager of Agrippas HaMelech's house or palace.
Translates to steward on this Torah.
Steward. Okay. Well, he's Mamuna, a person in charge. Okay. So Kegoinani Sha'eni Ragel Lechol Ela Suda Achas. I'm only used to eating one meal a day. Would I be allowed or obligated to have only one meal, be pater, and then be exempt? Because that's that I'm doing like I'm like in my house. It's the source of this whole law is Teshvu Kien Taduru. Dwell in your sukkah like you dwell in your house. I only eat one meal in my house. Would I be exempt after I eat one meal? Or one meal a day? So the answer that Rabbi Eliezer gave him was that every day you add many parparois. Parparois meant like these either delicacies for yourself and for your own interests. Can't you at least for Hashem, to honor Hashem, to honor your creator, can you have one parperes for Hashem? Can you have one delicacy for Hashem and fulfill the mitzvah of eating in a sukkah? In other words, and have this, second meal in the sukkah. Now, what does that mean? That if you, one way of understanding it is all you need to do is eat one extra delicacy, and that could be considered a meal, and you could fulfill the mitzvah of the second meal that you're obligated on every day. Which this is maybe again, or maybe this is even more clear, the source that parperes are considered a meal, that you need to have two meals. Here you see that it actually works even as one of the two meals. That's what's interesting here. Here, what we're seeing is that this man was only wanted to have one meal a day, and Rebbe Eliezer said, no, you need two meals a day. And one of those two meals, you could be yaitza with the parperois. You could be yaitza with this extra delicacy, which I guess means since you normally only eat one meal a day, this extra meal is only a bonus. So maybe you could fulfill it with this extra, with something extra, which would also be a source that maybe on Shabbos, if you want to have this, that if you ate the regular meals, so then as an extra meal, you could fulfill with this parperes, with this extra thing. In other words, that would be an understanding, one of the understandings of how you learn from here about Shalashuddis. It's interesting how the Gemara, how the Paiskim, how the rabbis, the authorities, they bring this as a source. They bring this Gemara as a source for the Shalashuddis. How are they really proving it? It's Rebbe Eliezer. It's not even the rabbi's opinion. This is the non-accepted view, and there's even question if this whole discussion happened before Rebbe Eliezer himself backed out of this whole thing. because Rabbi Eliezer also backed out of his opinion that you need 14 meals. So before he backed out, it could be that that's where Rabbi Eliezer was saying this, was mentioning this, that this man asked Rabbi Eliezer the question, do I need to have these second meal? And the answer was, yes, you do need to have a parperis. Now, there's another way of understanding this, and that is eat one more appetizer, and that will cause you to eat another meal. So that's another way of understanding it, that it's not that he's going to get away with a appetizer, but really that this will lead you to eating an extra meal. And then the other option is, the third way of learning it was, can't you push away some of your appetizers and then you'll have room to eat, you'll have space to eat another meal. So that was the third way of learning it. And he also asked him, this apotropos, this steward or building manager, he asked him, I have two wives, one in Tiveria, one in Tzipori. And if I remember correctly, Tzipori is right outside of Tiveria. I think we've learned about some people, they would accept Shabbos in one place and maybe finish Shabbos in the other. And I think that was Tiveria and Tzipori, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, so he had two wives, one in Tiveria, one in Tzipori. V'yeshli shtei sukkahs, and I have two sukkahs. How's right? Can I go out from one sukkah to the other sukkah and be exempt? In other words, if one day I spend in one sukkah, can I do that and spend the other day in another sukkah? And the Gemara says, and the Rabbi Eliezer answers him, Amar lai. He says, no, you can't do that. Shani Omer, because I say, you go from one sukkah to the other sukkah, then you ruin the mitzvah that you did in the first sukkah, because the sukkah has to be a sukkah that you dwell in for 7 days. And if you end up leaving it, you end up transgressing that. And Tanya Rabbi Eliezer, I remember we learned in a brayso, Rabbi Eliezer says, on page 27b now, we don't go from one sukkah to another sukkah. And you can't make a sukkah on Chol HaMoyed. In other words, sukkah has to be a 7-day sukkah. And the rabbis say you could go from one sukkah to another sukkah, which means you don't have to have a sukkah that you dwell in all 7 days. You could really dwell in it a few days and go to another sukkah a few days, and you can go from one sukkah to another. And if you didn't build a sukkah, you could actually build a sukkah on Chol HaMoyed, or you could build, and there's no problem with not having the sukkah last for 7 days. And everyone agrees. What happens if it fell? Everyone agrees that you could rebuild it, because we consider it that it's the same sukkah. According to Rabbi Eliezer, you could only have one sukkah. That's really the same sukkah. That's the way the Gemara understands it, and as the Gemara explains. My time at Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer learns from a pasuk. It says Sukkahs you should make 7 days. Asi sukkah l'shiva. Now it says the word haruya, but the other commentaries take out that word over there and say it doesn't fit over here. But it's really, you should make a sukkah l'shiva for 7 days, and that it's a sukkah that has to last 7 days. Rabbanan harigam rachmana asi sukkah b'chag. The rabbis say no, it just means make a sukkah for the holiday, but it doesn't necessarily have to be for all 7 days. Make the sukkah for the Yom Tov, but not necessarily for all 7 days. It's for the Yom Tov that happens to last 7 days. Make sure you have a sukkah for the holiday. And then the Gemara says that Pshita, isn't that obvious that you can rebuild it? I would have thought that this is a new sukkah and it's not the same one. And therefore, it's considered a new sukkah. Rabbi Eliezer should say it doesn't work. Kamash B'lana comes and lets us hear that no, we look at it that it's the same sukkah and it actually will work. It's considered a kosher sukkah. It's a sukkah for 7 days. Yeah, that's basically the Gemara. We're going to stop here. Have a wonderful Shabbos, everyone. Zay gesund.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Shalom.
We actually make up another mitzvah on a different day. We if the first day is Shabbos, we don't take the lulav, and we make up for it, and we say Shechianu on the second day.
You make up for the Shechianu, basically.
Yeah.
Right.
So maybe that would be a precedent. Also, my grandmother said that when it was Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh, they actually made an extra parperis. They made a second kugel.
Because by the Torahs, it's how many Torahs you take out, you make an extra kugel.
Right.
A Lukshan kugel, and if there's 3 Torahs like Hanukkah, Rosh Chodesh, you can do a Lukshan kugel, a potato kugel, and a farfel kugel.
However you pronounce it, like the Targim, whatever it is.
Right.
I'm trying to find if there's a Greek word I could identify with it.
Anyway, I'm not really sure if you could call it a makeup when you talk about the lulav on the second day, just because you say shachiyanu, because you're not really making up the first day. You're doing the second day's obligation of a sukkah, of a lulav, and there is question if it's even considered biblical, So because the second day is really a Yom Tov Sheni Shel Goliath, which it's only minhag Avosenu B'Yodenu, and it's a it's not really even. But the first day is considered D'Oraisa. So even though we're machmir because we want to consider the second day a suffix D'Oraisa because that was the minhag, but at the same time you can't really say it's a. I don't know if you could really call it a makeup. That's all. But
remember, we do the same thing in Israel though, where it isn't the second day.
Right, and you say shachiyanu, but so it's not a makeup. So that would be that makes it more clear.
Picking it up for the first time.
Yes, so if somebody was on the road and they couldn't get home, and then they came on the third day, then we'd also tell them to say shachiyanu.
Right, correct. Right. I just don't know if you call that a makeup.
Okay.
Yeah, you know what I mean? It's the first time you do a mitzvah, you say shachiyanu. Anyways, I goes on to everyone.
Have a good shot.
Thank
you, Rabbi.